doesn't necessarily maybe have the relevance in our lives. So I'm going to trust you to lead us wherever you feel your community and my family is best served.
Mm. Thank you so much. I feel the same implicit trust. And I will say before we even started, because I know whenever I have a conversation with you, Greg, it is mind blowing and expansive. And I said a little prayer and intention, and I just called in. You know, you've
Mm.
written all about the beautiful divine matrix, and I just called in my understanding of this divine matrix, and I just said, please guide this, because there is so much happening in the world right now. A lot of turbulence, a lot of shift. We have an election year here in the States, you know, and I was thinking, I know from so many listeners that write in about this time also in the midst of a lot of challenge and dark times, that there's this desire, you know, to shift our own consciousness and awaken and tap into our hearts and heart intelligence. And I think that might be a good place to start. I know it's a huge question. It keeps coming to me is, how do we do this in a real way when there are all kinds of, you know, challenges
Sure.
and atrocities happening, and an interesting year ahead? Like, where do we start, and how do we do this work?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I don't think there's any single solution. I think there are probably many answers. What I have found in our community, and like you, the end of the year was tough because of what's happening in the Middle East, certainly, and in other places, what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in our country. You and I live in America, and our country is not the country that we had at the beginning of the year last year, and we're all seeing, to the degree that we will allow ourselves to see it, we're seeing these changes happen. One of the things I'm seeing happening, Julie, it's a psychological term. It's called normalcy bias. Normalcy bias is when we witness or experience things that are so foreign to our belief system, to our expectation, to our worldview, that we will not allow ourselves to acknowledge these things are even happening. I'll give you a classic textbook example. I'm not saying this is happening now, but if you read about normalcy bias in a psychology textbook, they will give World War II and the Holocaust as an example. In Poland, there were people that saw their friends and neighbors, loved ones, family members take a suitcase. They were allowed one suitcase and board a train. And the story that they told one another to make sense of this is that the people on the train were the lucky ones because they were being relocated to a new city, a new life, new jobs, while the war was being prosecuted in their home. They had heard rumors about the camps, about Auschwitz and Treblinka and the death camps, but their normalcy bias would not allow them to fathom that such large numbers of people could be systematically herded off that way. So they never let that enter their mind. And in a very real sense, it's not on the same magnitude, certainly, but we're seeing a degree of change in the world and certainly in our own country. And there's a tendency to overlook it, normalcy bias, to accept and normalize things in our lives that we would never accept and normalize in a million years in a sane world. Indoctrination of our children in public schools in certain ways, healthcare practices, you know, all kinds of things. And what happens, you and I talked about this a little bit before we hit the record button, is when you live in a world and something comes along that is outside of that norm, and in a typical world you wouldn't accept it, but you do. You go along with it because everybody else is, or we're being, you know, the media says it's okay, or all of our friends say it's okay, and you begin to normalize something in your life that you would never accept in a million years. So now what used to be normal for you here is no longer there. It's over here. All right. So he says, you know, no big deal. Life still goes on. Still got, you know, job, kids are healthy. So now something else comes along and you do that again, and it takes you from here over to here and from here over to there. pretty soon you wake up one morning and you are so far away from the norms of what you would want your children to accept and what you'd want to live in your life. And you say, how did we get here? That's kind of what's happening in the world right now. Not just in America. And you said we have an election year this year. I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but something is happening on planet Earth that has never happened in the modern world. 40 Western nations are having elections this year. 40 nations are now up choosing new leaders, and there's a tremendous concern among some circles that those leaders going to conform with the ideology moving the world in a direction of centralization and control, or are those leaders going to opt for sovereignty and freedom? And we don't know the answer to that until those elections happen. So it's a big year for the world, not just for America. What I think is I'm seeing happen, and October 7th really brought it to the forefront, Julie, and I don't want to dwell on it. It's important, and it happens to be the pivotal moment that for many people brought into focus something that they didn't want to have in focus, that they didn't want to deal with. And now they're forced to because these events happened. And that is, how do we respond? How do we respond to those things? So let me, we talked off camera a little bit, and I'm just going to reiterate some of that. What I want our viewers to know, it's a difficult conversation. I was in London in my hotel room 2 hours before I went on stage when the news feeds started coming in of what was happening, and especially at the Nova Music Festival. And so I saw that America was asleep because of the time difference. They were, I think, 7 hours behind. When I got back to the hotel room that night, I started watching the US. I don't usually watch TV, but I tuned into the networks to see what was going on. And here's what I saw, Julie. The news feeds that America was allowed to share with everyday people was very different from the news feeds originally coming out of the Middle East, out of Eastern Europe, out of Asia. And the reason I'm saying this is because America has not been allowed to see the truth of what happened on October 7th. Part of that is politically driven narrative. Part of that is the social media algorithms will not allow, through community guidelines, they won't allow the images. The net result is we have a generation of young people who say that the atrocities never happened. They're saying if they did happen, we would have seen them. Or if they did happen, why don't we know about them? And so they are now not having that information. They are making choices in their lives and publicly protesting in ways that don't make a lot of sense. It makes sense to them based upon this skewed and distorted information that they were given. And to some degree, that's happening to all of us. We are all casualties to some degree because we are not really being allowed to see. We're seeing distorted views of what happens in Ukraine, of what's happening at the Texas border right now, of what happens socially. And all of this is dividing. It's breaking the social bonds that have held our families together for generations, that have held our communities together, our societies, and ultimately our nation. So we have become a very divided nation because the social bonds are being broken through misinformation, disinformation. And a lot of it, I believe, is intentional because there is an effort to create a more vulnerable society. And this has deeply spiritual implications. But when we don't have those social bonds, Julie, we are susceptible and vulnerable to the ideas and the policies of others that want to drive us in a certain direction. Right now, we're being driven towards centralization, toward control, loss of freedoms across the board. And a lot of it is coming from from the UN. A lot of it is coming from other organizations linked to the UN. We can do a whole conversation on that. Everybody knows. I'm not saying anything anybody doesn't already know. The point is, we have to deal with it. This is what's up for us every day in our lives. And what I have found in my community, for example, I'll just take the atrocities in Ukraine and what's happening in Ukraine, because the war crimes are happening there as well, or the war crimes that are happening in the Middle East, in Israel. What it does, Julie, is it triggers something deep within us. And the management of the information triggers very precise reactions. Primal instincts are triggered when we see women and children abused and killed. Primal instincts are triggered when we see helpless families and the elderly. And we then want to react. And what's happening, my friends, some of them you have on this program, authors that people know, they don't know what to do, because they are feeling an anger, they're feeling a hate, they're feeling rage, they want revenge in some cases, based upon the narratives that they're being shown. So what do we do with that? How do we deal with that in a healthy way? What I have found, and this is where it is a really deeply spiritual conversation, is it's less about how we respond and more about what we become in the presence of that response. Do we allow what we see in the media to make us into something that we would never choose to be in a million years? Do we allow the narrative that has been carefully honed to trigger us? Do we allow that to reduce us to this primal instinctual level where we lash out in hate and anger and revenge? And we have to ask ourselves, when we feel those reactions, which are perfectly normal human reactions, they're being engineered. When we feel those, we have to be honest with ourselves and say, is this information making me into something that I don't want to be? Is it making me become? Because we are not healthy when we go through our day carrying the hate and the anger and the feeling for the need for revenge. So when we find ourselves in those reactions, we have to ask, are we reacting from the love of what we know is possible and true in our lives, or are we reacting from the hate or the fear of what that information is triggering within us? And the answer to that question then takes us to the next steps in terms of what we need to do. If we find ourselves being triggered in fear, where does that fear come from? How could something halfway around the world incite fear inside of us in our homes? What is it lighting up? What fear in our lives has never been resolved? What trauma has never been resolved? And I'm not saying it's good, bad, right, or wrong. This is where we are right now in our world, because there's so many events and so many atrocities that are happening. When we respond, are we going to respond in a healthy way? So now there are some people I've had, there's the argument about the inner warrior. Do you fight or do you turn the other cheek? And for me, I think it's less about what we do, again, and more about what we become. If we choose to fight, whatever that means, if it's a kinetic fight or if it's a social media fight, if it's a verbal confrontation, whatever it is, does that come from the love of those behind us, our family and our loved ones, or does it come from the hate of those that we perceive to be our enemies? Do we fight from the love of what we know is possible, or from the fear of what happens if we don't? And there's a lot of narratives out there about fear, inciting fear in people, that what you're seeing happening over there can happen right here. So it's an important conversation. It's difficult because there are so many other narratives and so much baggage that come with it. But on the ultimate, deeply, I'll ask your permission Do I have your permission to go to the ultimate, deeply spiritual level? Are you okay with that?
Oh, I'm like waiting for it.
All
Yeah,
right. So
please.
I think all
Yeah.
of this, although it is current in our lives now, is actually part of something very ancient and very primal that has been with us from the very beginning. It's a battle between good and evil, not from a religious sense, but we live in a polarity world. And in a polarity world, both of those must be present. The question is, what do we identify with, and what do we choose to dominate our world? And you're seeing that battle play out in media, in entertainment, in politics. You're seeing it play out kinetically in what happened at that Nova Music Festival and beyond. You're seeing it happen with what's happening in Ukraine. A lot of people don't know this. U.S. has boots on the ground. We're involved in wars, 22 wars on the planet right now. Most of them you never hear about. Most of them you never hear a word about. And all of them are carrying the same message. These events, Ukraine and what's happened in the Middle East, happen to be lighting it up for us front and center. And we have to choose. We have to make a stand. Do we identify with the evil, or do we identify with the good? And what do we allow? What do we normalize in our lives and accept into our society? And again, it's a question we have to answer together. It can't be done for us. But it's difficult when the events are weaponized to divide us rather than used to bring us together in kindness so that we can work together to create a better world. That's a possibility, but that's not what's happening right now. And there's more of us than there is of they. We haven't even talked about who the they are, but there's more of us. We get to choose. And I think it's really important now, Julie, because I think you have a very sophisticated audience, and that's why I really enjoy coming on with your audience, because we don't have to start at ground zero every time. We can assume certain things are known and accepted. One of those is, I think we can all agree and assume that there's a new world emerging that's not quite here yet. And the old world that we grew up with, it's still there, but it's buckling and collapsing because it's unsustainable in its present form. So that new world's not here yet because we're still building it. I don't know everyone in your community or on this podcast, but I bet I know this about everyone. I would imagine anyone watching this does not want to carry the hurt from the world that we've known into that new world as the foundation of that new world for our children. We don't want to carry the suffering that we've known in the 19th and the 20th centuries and the Holocausts and the atrocities, humans against humans. We don't want to carry that into the new world. And it's up for us to heal right now. If we respond with hate and anger, doesn't mean we don't fight, but do we fight from hate and revenge, or do we fight from the love of what we know is possible in our lives, what we want for our children? That becomes that keystone or the cornerstone or the foundation of that new world. I think we are dealing with generational healing right now. So I just covered a lot of ground. I said a lot. I'm going to pause and I'm going to just ask you if it makes sense. And maybe you have other guests talking about the same thing. And where do they chime in on this?
Well, first of all, there is so much in what you just said. And I love that you went to the deep end of the spiritual pool. And these are the questions that I've been getting from our beautiful listeners, my own soul. And I think this where I felt the lighting up is, this archaic world, the past traumas and the new world emerging, and kind of how do I know anybody watching or listening right now, like attracts like, is here because they want to come, you want to come from love. You want to come from healing. You want to come from, makes me want to cry. Even just saying it, I can feel it. Being a part of something better, more beautiful, more loving. I think of your book about the divine matrix. And to me, it's like, I literally read and like submerge myself in that daily because I just love to be reminded that there's something greater that's loving, that is in every cell and atom and every aspect of who we are. And so what I'm hearing or sensing, it's like, how do we, and I don't mean this in a Pollyanna way, but like, how do we dive into that responding from love, knowing this is what's going on, creating that new world, and also being aware that we're being fed a lot of fear and a lot of, as you said, meant to be vulnerable. And maybe I'll start there.
Well, I think, again, I don't think there's a single answer or a single solution. I think there are many answers. However, people are feeling drawn to respond that's their choice. I think where the spirituality comes is being conscious of what drives that response. Am I responding because I'm afraid of the world if I don't, or what will happen to me if I don't? Or I'll just be very honest. When October 7th happened, I looked to our spiritual community and you could hear a pin drop in the room because our spiritual leaders were absent in mass. And I've called some of them and I've talked to them. I'm said, where are you guys? Your community needs you to help them navigate what's happening here. Some of them have found that their teachings are shallow teachings. They're not bad and they're not wrong. They are just shallow. They're good time spirituality. And it's easy to be a spiritual person when the world looks rosy and rainbows. When something crosses your path, if your spiritual practice does not serve you, you have to ask, why is that? And what can I do to embrace a deeper spirituality? And some I know people that are struggling because their teachings are not serving their community in the face of what we're seeing happening in the world. It's a hard conversation, Julie, and it's very honest. It's a very honest conversation. Some of the spiritual teachers said they just can't see it. They said, I can't watch this. It's too hard. I talked to somebody that says, I'm just going to go to the beach and do my yoga. I can't deal with it. And we all feel like that sometimes. We have to take a break. But we're blessed to have a beach to go to do our spiritual practice. And some of our brothers and sisters are just trying to make it through the
NaviComp Online. Approaching engine cutoff.